For decades, Stalin's official image was shaped by Soviet propaganda and the support of some Western allies. His decisions during the Second World War marked the course of millions, both on the front and in the occupied territories. He turned every victory into a mechanism to extend his control, displacing entire populations, imposing puppet governments, and using fear as a tool of power. As Soviet troops advanced, structures that would silence any form of opposition were also consolidated. The trials, internal purges, and political manipulation were presented as necessary measures to maintain stability. The Soviet model was not limited to the borders of the USSR. It was forcibly exported to other countries under the discourse of liberation. Stalin did not need to leave Moscow to redraw the European map. He did it from his offices, with reports, orders, and lists. To what extent was the West complicit in that domination? For years, most citizens of countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe have conceived of the global conflict from 1939 to 1945 as a contention provoked solely by Hitler. Depending on each version, everything begins with the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, the rise of the Nazi leader in 1933, the dispatch of German troops to the Rhine in 1936, the conference held in Munich in 1938, or the destruction of Kristallnacht. Others set the starting point at the German occupation of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, or more directly, at the beginning of the offensive on Poland on the 1st of September of that same year. But in all cases, Hitler occupies the central role as the figure who gives shape and meaning to the entire tragedy. Cinematographic productions have kept that focus alive. From the filming done in the midst of the war, like Casablanca, to recent films like Inglourious Basterds, the characters of the Nazi regime have served as permanent antagonists. In political speeches, the figure of Hitler continues to be used as the extreme example of evil, to which one resorts to attack any ideological rival. Although there are no public defenders of Nazi Germany, except for ironic or parodic cases like the work of Mel Brooks, the image of Hitler remains present as a universal symbol of horror. The memory of the crimes of that period has united many people in absolute rejection of fascism, anti-Semitism, and racist policies. However, this vision of the conflict focused only on Hitler begins to lose strength as one moves towards Eastern Europe or Asia. In much of Eastern Europe, the imprint of German domination was less lasting than that of the system established by Stalin, which lasted for several more decades. Beyond the Volga River, the presence of the Third Reich practically left no trace. In regions of the Asian continent, where Germany did not even participate directly in the conflict, the legacy of that period is exclusively linked to the Soviet Union. Governments such as those of China, North Korea, and Vietnam emerged after the influence of the communist model, without Hitler's machinery ever intervening in their territories. In the case of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, which provoked the formal entry of the United States into the conflict, Hitler had no direct participation. Although Germany's declaration of war facilitated the Roosevelt administration prioritizing the fight in Europe, the initiative came from the Pacific Axis. Within Russia, even after the official rejection of communism, the figure of Stalin and the memory of the so-called Great Patriotic War continue to occupy a predominant place in the collective memory. In these narratives, the Soviet dictator appears more present than Hitler himself. From Moscow, Budapest, or Bucharest, what happened between 1939 and 1945 is not perceived as a simple war against German fascism, but as the beginning of a long period of Soviet control which in many places lasted until 1989. In Asia, where the Soviet occupation marked the destiny of entire nations, the war did not end with the German surrender. In Korea, China, and other strategic points, the communist domination imposed by Moscow prolonged the aftermath of the conflict for several more decades. This alternative vision not only questions Hitler's exclusive protagonism, but also highlights Stalin's active role as a key figure in the development and prolongation of the war. Although the democratic regimes of the West assumed that the enemy to be defeated was Germany, the Soviet Union took advantage of the conflict to expand territorially and politically. Many of the countries that were part of Eastern Europe came under Soviet domination, not due to Hitler's actions, but due to Stalin's strategic decisions. While in the West parades and tributes were celebrated after the victory, in the east of the continent a different stage began. What for some was liberation, for others meant the beginning of an occupation. The Red Army advanced through territories devastated by the conflict, but instead of withdrawing after defeating the Axis forces, it remained and imposed governments favorable to Moscow. This occupation, often presented as liberation, brought with it the establishment of authoritarian regimes, surveillance systems, elimination of opponents, and absolute control from the Kremlin. In this context, Stalin's intentions before the outbreak of the war acquire a new dimension. Far from being a spectator or a victim of Hitler's decisions, the Soviet leader acted on his own initiative. During the years prior to the outbreak of the conflict, he developed a foreign policy aimed at taking advantage of any confrontation between the Western powers to strengthen his position. By signing the pact with Germany in 1939, Stalin not only guaranteed security for his country, but also obtained territories that expanded his influence. The agreement included secret clauses that allowed the Soviet occupation of regions such as the Baltic states and part of Poland. These actions did not respond to an immediate defensive need, but to a well-calculated strategy. In the following months, the Soviet Union took every opportunity to consolidate its power in Eastern Europe. Without interference from the Western Allies, the Kremlin advanced on Finland, annexed Romanian territories, and completely occupied the Baltic countries. These movements were not limited to a response to external threats. They were part of a plan designed to expand its area of control. The coordination with German forces during the partition of Poland demonstrates that, at least in that initial stage, both regimes acted in synchrony. The images of Soviet and German troops celebrating together the fall of Warsaw reflect a tactical alliance that benefited both sides. During that period, Stalin remained firm in his decision to stay out of an open conflict with Germany. Despite clear signs of a possible betrayal, he avoided any movement that could provoke a reaction from Hitler. Meanwhile, he focused his efforts on securing the borders, strengthening defenses, and reorganizing the military apparatus. Although previous purges had weakened the Red Army, training, equipping, and indoctrination campaigns were undertaken to prepare the country for a conflict that, sooner or later, seemed inevitable. Stalin's calculation was clear. If the confrontation between Germany and the Western powers prolonged, the Soviet Union could benefit without needing to get directly involved in the first years of the war. Time played in his favor. While the countries of Western Europe wore themselves out, Moscow consolidated its internal control, expanded its external influence, and reinforced its position on the international stage. This waiting was not passive but strategic. The decisions made by Stalin during this initial stage were decisive for the subsequent development of the conflict and for the political map that emerged after its conclusion. In June of 1941, German troops began their march into Soviet territory. The operation, known as Barbarossa, triggered the official entry of the USSR into the war against Germany. Before that attack, Stalin had maintained an ambiguous stance. He had signed agreements with Hitler, had invaded border territories, and his regime continued to repress internally. However, the German advance changed international public perception and positioned him as a key player in the global conflict. From that moment on, Western diplomatic machinery began to see him as an ally, not out of sympathy but out of strategic necessity. Great Britain was the first to react. Winston Churchill, despite his known rejection of communism, announced immediate support for the Soviet Union. He did so without demanding conditions, without asking for ideological changes or guarantees. From London, messages of unity and cooperation were sent, while planning for military and logistical aid began. Churchill understood that any adversary of the Nazi regime had to be incorporated into the joint effort, even if it was a dictator he had criticized for years. The United States, for its part, quickly followed suit. Although it had not yet formally entered the war, the Roosevelt government was preparing to support the USSR through the Lend-Lease program. This initiative allowed the sending of war materials and industrial products without immediate compensation. What was sent was not only weapons, but also trucks, locomotives, fuel, food, and medicines. All of this was directed toward a country that, until recently, was seen as an ideological enemy. The figures for Western support grew rapidly. In the first months after the German invasion, thousands of tons of supplies began to cross the ocean. From the ports of the United Kingdom and the United States, convoys escorted by warships departed, carrying everything from steel to canned meat. A considerable part of these shipments arrived via the Arctic, traversing dangerous routes exposed to naval attacks. The USSR received these shipments with a mixture of urgency and distrust, knowing that each delivery could make the difference between resisting or falling to the advances of the Wehrmacht. Within the Soviet Union, the impact of foreign aid was immediate. Factories that had been displaced eastward resumed production with American components. Mobile divisions improved their mobility thanks to thousands of Ford and Studebaker trucks. Soviet aviation began to incorporate engines and spare parts that were not produced in the country. Even the food supply in the most affected cities was sustained, in part, thanks to American products. Without these supplies, the defensive and offensive capabilities of the Red Army would have been very different. Stalin, meanwhile, took advantage of this new position. From being considered an expansionist aggressor, he came to be portrayed as the defender of the free world. Soviet propaganda adjusted immediately. Official publications began to show Stalin as a sensible, firm and necessary leader for the Allied triumph. The purges, mass deportations, pacts with Hitler, and previous invasions of Finland, Poland and the Baltic states were omitted from the public narrative. Instead, a narrative was constructed that positioned him as a strategic leader in the fight against fascism. Roosevelt adopted this vision without many reservations. At the White House, intelligence reports detailing the crimes of the Stalinist regime were filed or ignored. What mattered most was the military utility of the Red Army. The Soviet presence on the Eastern Front served to relieve pressure on Great Britain and delay a possible German offensive to the west. The more men, tanks and resources Hitler committed in the USSR, the better for the Anglo-American strategy. Under this logic, Stalin became a key partner, without needing to reform or be held accountable. In the diplomatic meetings that began to be organized, Soviet emissaries were treated as representatives of a legitimate power. Requests for aid were heard, material requests were attended to, and gestures of courtesy were frequent. The distrust that had marked relations before 1941 quickly disappeared. In its place, a pragmatic cooperation was established, where ideological differences remained in the background. The priority was the common enemy, and Stalin knew how to exploit this context in his favor. Churchill, though more cautious than Roosevelt, also adapted to the new reality. He held personal conversations with Stalin, sought operational agreements, and authorized joint missions. In several public speeches, he referred to the USSR as a heroic nation. In private, however, he continued to have reservations. His main objective remained protecting British interests in the Mediterranean, but he could not ignore the growing weight of the USSR on the global stage. Cooperation with Stalin was not an option but a necessity imposed by the dynamics of the conflict. Meanwhile, on the ground, Soviet advances were celebrated by Western media. Each counterattack, each recovered city, each German division halted was presented as a sign that the communist regime had changed, or at least that it was doing the right thing for once. Images of Soviet soldiers liberating villages, rebuilding bridges, and distributing food circulated in the press as proof of Allied commitment. Rarely was the internal cost, repressive methods, or summary executions mentioned. The dominant narrative was that of a necessary alliance. This image transformation benefited Stalin beyond the military field. In diplomatic conferences, his voice gained weight. In future reconstruction plans, his opinion was considered. And in negotiations over the fate of Europe, his demands began to be accepted. In a matter of months, he had gone from being an uncomfortable partner to a central actor. Without modifying his style of government or being held accountable for his previous decisions, he managed to position himself as a respected ally. The continuous delivery of weaponry, transport and resources allowed the Red Army to reorganize, gain mobility, and plan larger-scale offensives. American tanks complemented Soviet models. Jeeps and trucks facilitated the movement of troops and ammunition. Light artillery was reinforced with British-made pieces. The Eastern Front became a field of joint experimentation, where Western logistical efforts sustained a good part of the Soviet military machinery. This stage of the war marked a turning point. The Soviet Union ceased to be observed with suspicion and became an essential part of the coalition seeking to defeat Hitler. This alliance, born of urgency, deliberately ignored Stalin's recent history. The objective was clear: win the war. Everything else, including political responsibilities and internal abuses, was postponed for another time. Thus, a relationship that would define the following years was consolidated. Stalin, strengthened by military triumphs and supported by Western shipments, gained influence on the international stage, and Roosevelt and Churchill, despite their personal and strategic differences, agreed that maintaining this collaboration was indispensable for achieving final victory. During the years 1943 and 1944, the Soviet military advance on the Eastern Front shifted from defensive containment to a sustained offensive that pushed the Red Army towards Central Europe and the Balkans. The retreat of the Third Reich offered Stalin the opportunity to expand Soviet influence beyond its borders, under the argument of liberating occupied peoples. However, the actions deployed by Soviet military commands and security agencies indicated an organized strategy to impose structures subordinate to Moscow. Operations on the ground combined military action with the installation of obedient provisional governments, purges of elements considered hostile to communism, and deportations of minorities or political groups that could hinder Soviet dominance. The reconquest of territories previously occupied by Axis forces was used as justification for intervening in the political composition of each country. In Poland, the advance of the Red Army was accompanied by the dissolution of the resistance loyal to the Polish government in exile, replacing it with popular committees backed by the NKVD. At the same time, leaders of the Armia Krajowa were arrested or eliminated, even when they had fought against the Germans. In the most visible cases, such as the Warsaw Uprising, Soviet inaction was combined with propaganda that discredited the insurgents, allowing German forces to destroy the city without direct intervention from Moscow, despite its proximity. In the Baltic countries, the pattern was repeated with faster measures. Soviet troops, after expelling the German occupiers, established administrations under communist control and proceeded to identify and deport sectors of the population that had collaborated with the Nazis or represented nationalist interests. Mass deportations included farmers, teachers, clergy, and former public officials. In Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, social surveillance mechanisms were established with NKVD support, dismantling religious, educational, and cultural structures alien to the Soviet model. Agricultural collectivization was rapidly implemented, transforming the economic landscape and displacing thousands of families. In Romania, the entry of the Red Army coincided with a coup d'état that overthrew the pro-fascist government. Although the country formally changed sides, Soviet influence was consolidated through continuous military presence, the imposition of an Allied Control Commission dominated by Soviet representatives, and the reorganization of the political system according to Moscow's interests. Communist leaders, previously exiled or marginalized, were placed in key positions, while traditional parties were displaced. Media outlets began to disseminate versions favorable to the USSR, and activities considered contrary to the new order were restricted. In Bulgaria, the situation was similar. The establishment of a Fatherland Front government, backed by Soviet military presence, led to an institutional restructuring that allowed for the trial and execution of former political and military leaders. Popular trials acquired an exemplary character, seeking to eliminate any future opposition and legitimize the new administration. Simultaneously, the educational system was reorganized, and a historical narrative favorable to the USSR was promoted, while economic reforms aimed at aligning the country with the Soviet planned model were initiated. In Yugoslavia, although partisans led by Tito had operated autonomously during much of the conflict, collaboration with Moscow intensified at this stage. The USSR provided logistical and military support at key moments, consolidating the communist position against other factions. After the liberation of Belgrade, relations between Tito and Stalin remained in terms of cooperation, although the Yugoslav leadership retained a degree of independence in its internal structure. Soviet influence was perceptible in the organization of intelligence services, in the training of political cadres, and in the orientation of social reforms promoted by the new government. The Red Army's action was not limited to the military front. Teams from the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs and the NKVD accompanied combat units to coordinate administrative transition. In many cases, local military commanders were replaced by political commissars responsible for supervising the ideological loyalty of emerging authorities. Rear areas became scenes of purges, censorship, and political reorganization. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other regions, The Soviets favored the formation of seemingly broad fronts, but structured so that communists occupied decisive positions. The official narrative presented these actions as processes of national liberation. Soviet media described the arrival of the Red Army as the definitive defeat of fascism, while omitting the violence applied against dissident sectors or the absolute control over political and economic resources. School textbooks, pamphlets and radio programs disseminated a unified version of events, centered on the brotherhood among Slavic peoples and Stalin's enlightened leadership as the conductor of victory. Repression mechanisms expanded as the occupation prolonged. In many cases, arrests were justified by collaboration with the enemy, but the criteria were broad and difficult to verify. Summary trials and deportations multiplied, affecting former members of the fascist apparatus as well as democratic socialists, liberals, monarchists, and organized Catholics. The general strategy consisted of emptying the political space of any real opposition before consolidating new constitutions and parliaments dominated by the local Communist Party. Religious institutions were subjected to similar restrictions. In many liberated countries, ecclesiastical hierarchies were perceived as allies of the old regime or as centers of ideological resistance. Seminaries were closed, church properties were expropriated, and clergy were subjected to surveillance. In some cases, schisms were encouraged, or parallel churches were promoted, led by figures willing to cooperate with the new order. Charitable or religious teaching activities were subject to strict authorizations or were eliminated altogether. Agrarian reforms, promoted as part of the revolutionary program, also functioned as an instrument of control. Land was redistributed to poor peasants, but under conditions that forced them to integrate into cooperatives supervised by communist cadres. In many regions, new landowners were pressured to denounce former landlords or neighbors considered hostile to the system. These measures generated dependence on party structures and weakened traditional community ties. In economic terms, the transition to centralized models began. Industries passed into state hands or merged into conglomerates under Soviet supervision. Trade exchanges were reoriented towards the USSR, displacing Western partners. 5-year plans were adopted, heavy production was prioritized, and consumer goods were limited. In cities, product scarcity and price controls marked the beginning of a new stage characterized by rationing, queues, and bureaucratic management. All this process was accompanied by a constant military presence. Although the formal independence of the new governments was proclaimed, Red Army garrisons remained deployed at strategic points, with the capacity to intervene in case of any political deviation. Internal security remained subordinate to intelligence services formed or directed by Soviet advisors. The sovereignty of each country was, in practice, conditioned by Moscow's will. Between 1943 and 1944, the war ceased to be merely a military confrontation and transformed into an extension of Soviet political power. Under the pretext of liberating Europe from fascism, Stalin projected a new order in which the occupied territories had to align with the communist model, both institutionally and socially. The advance of the Red Army did not simply imply a German retreat, but the replacement of one authoritarian domination by another, with new actors, new symbols, and new mechanisms of control, but with an equally vertical and unappealable logic. After the capitulation of the Third Reich, Stalin became the most influential leader of the Eurasian continent. From Moscow, he began to design a new international order under the parameters of the Soviet model, taking advantage of the political and economic collapse of the rest of Europe. With the military occupation of a large part of Eastern Europe, the Kremlin imposed a radical restructuring of local systems, displacing previous administrations and replacing them with councils directly subordinate to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In cities such as Warsaw, Sofia, Bucharest, or East Berlin, the Soviet military presence coincided with a complete transformation of the state apparatus, while NKVD agents detained, interrogated, or eliminated former leaders, clerics, intellectuals, army officers, and figures associated with the past regime. This structural offensive was not limited to changing governments, but to dismantling the traditional social fabric, replacing cultural and professional elites with ideologically loyal cadres. In a matter of months, entire countries were integrated into a uniform political network, without real autonomy, where every relevant decision was supervised from Moscow. Through agreements reached at conferences such as Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin managed to legitimize many of these occupations, while his delegates controlled the reconstruction and economic planning committees. The Curzon Line served as a basis for redefining borders at the USSR's convenience, granting Poland German territories in compensation for those lost in the east, and displacing entire populations in demographic engineering operations coordinated by Soviet commissars. The process was neither negotiated nor gradual. Millions of people were forced to abandon their homes with barely a few hours' notice, and their properties were expropriated without compensation. To this were added mass deportations to Siberia or Central Asia, directed against minorities accused of collaborationism or simply considered unreliable for the new order. The Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Chechens, Ingush and other communities suffered this fate in cargo trains, without food or medical attention, with a high percentage of deaths during the journey. In parallel, the People's Republics were consolidated as Kremlin satellites. In each one, the pattern was identical: elimination of independent parties, monopoly of power by local communists, direct supervision from the Soviet embassy, and periodic internal purges to prevent deviations. The economy was centralized according to the 5-year planning model, with emphasis on heavy production and absolute state control. Ideological repression included the closure of unofficial media, the prohibition of religious organizations, systematic censorship, and permanent surveillance through secret services trained by the NKVD. Cultural doctrine aligned with socialist realism, imposing a unique narrative in all public expressions. Contacts with the outside world were severely restricted, and protest attempts were repressed without contemplation, as in the case of the uprising of German workers in 1953, repressed by Soviet tanks. Internationally, Stalin moved cautiously but firmly. While maintaining a facade of cooperation with Western allies, he pushed for a silent expansion of communism through cultural fronts, diplomatic missions, allied parties, and trade union movements. Networks of influence were created in France, Italy, Greece, Iran, and other countries, where Soviet financial and logistical support fueled internal conflicts or electoral campaigns favorable to his interests. The Cominform replaced the old Comintern as the coordinating center for these efforts, and from Moscow, the strategic lines for the communists of the world were defined. Soviet embassies became operational centers for propaganda, espionage, and recruitment, enlisting informants in all spheres. Tensions with Washington and London intensified, marking the beginning of a stage later known as the Cold War. Within the Soviet Union, the period was characterized by a tightening of control. The cult of personality reached its peak, with portraits of Stalin in every office, school, factory, and barracks. Official biographies omitted uncomfortable episodes and extolled his supposed achievements as a military strategist, thinker, scientist, and even artist. The population lived under a regime of constant surveillance, where neighborhood committees reported any behavior considered suspicious. Labor camps continued to function with thousands of prisoners performing forced labor, from mining excavations to canal construction. Although the country had emerged victorious from the war, the quality of life remained precarious for the majority, with shortages of basic products, deteriorated housing, deficient services, and minimum wages. The promised reforms did not arrive, and repression continued at all levels. Towards the end of the period, Stalin's health began to deteriorate. Although the inner circle tried to maintain appearances, his decision-making capacity became erratic. Paranoia intensified. He saw enemies everywhere, even among his oldest collaborators. A new wave of purges began, reaching the Kremlin's medical staff, accused of conspiring against his life in the well-known doctor's plot. Some of the detainees died under torture before being judged, and the atmosphere of distrust blocked the internal functioning of the state. Politburo sessions became unpredictable, with incoherent speeches and abrupt policy changes according to the leader's moods. No one dared to question him. Decisions were postponed or adopted without basis, and many high-ranking officials lived in constant fear of being arrested without prior notice. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died at his Kuntsevo residence. The news was announced hours later without precise details. The circumstances of his death still generate speculation, but official records indicated a cerebrovascular accident. For several days, crowds gathered to pay tribute, while authorities organized a state funeral in Moscow. The party, however, entered a process of internal rearrangement. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and other members of the High Command initiated maneuvers to define the new hierarchy, while ongoing judicial processes were halted and some political prisoners were released. Stalin's legacy, although publicly venerated at that time, began to be evaluated more critically by internal sectors that recognized the excesses, systematic violations, and damage caused to the country's own structure. Between the end of the war and his death, Stalin maintained total control of the country and a large part of the continent. He governed through an extended surveillance network, imposed political pacts, and rules designed to eliminate any opposition. The occupied territories did not see reforms or openness arrive, but rather strict control that replaced one regime with another, with no space for their own decisions or real changes.